So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Dan Bromberg. I'm pulling it up. I'm the interim director of the Carsey School. I've been the director of academic programs for quite some time, so I know most of you. I'm thrilled that we're able to do this. It's been too long. I think the last time we did this was in Manchester at the Foundry, which is probably 4 years ago, 3 years ago. So this is pretty great. It's great to bring people together. And it's great that we have two wonderful speakers joining us today. One traveling from long and far to be with us, so we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Audrey Osler with us. And I'll introduce both Carrie and Dr. Osler, Dr. Portrie as well. Old habits die hard, Carrie, so we're making our way there. So Carrie Portrie, Dr. Portrie joined the Carsey School in 2016. When she was still a student, working through her degree, she joined us as a program manager and has continued her work with New Hampshire Listens in one of the most impactful ways that we've seen here at Carsey. Digging into K through 12 education. Carrie's background is in early childhood special ed, and then she went on to pursue a PhD at UNH in education, always focusing on youth and community. So really focusing on place-based engagement and what that looks like in our school systems, in all of our child care facilities, our Head Start communities. So just really powerful work that Carrie's been doing. Carrie grew up in Dover, so I think making her way back to Dover and coming back to this area has just been a really wonderful synergy for us to see and watch that happen. We're also joined with someone who's not from Dover, although there's maybe a Dover not too far from you, as New England tends to be. Dr. Audrey Osler is a professor of education at the University of Southeastern Norway. I'm going to read this one because I don't know it as well. And the University of Leeds. She's editor-in-chief of Human Rights Education Review and co-convener of the World Education Research Association, IRN, on human rights education. Her research addresses education, migration, child rights, and youth participation in life history research. She has over 100 peer-reviewed publications, 15 books. We are really quite honored and lucky to have Audrey with us here today. And while Yvonne is not able to speak today because she's a little under the weather, we want to thank Yvonne for making this happen for us. Really great. So we are thrilled. So I am going to step away from the mic and turn it over to Carrie Portrie. Dr. Portrie, floor is yours.
So it's great to be here with everybody, a lot of familiar faces, of course. So basically, I just wanted to say what we're going to do right now. So what we're going to do is Audrey and I are going to have a conversation. We have some questions that we've talked through, and we'll have a conversation ourselves linked to human rights education. And then, so as we're talking, we invite you to think about some questions you might want to ask. So think about, as we're talking, what comes up for you and what you're thinking about, how it links into what you've studied here at Carsey or teach at the university or do in your community work. And then we'll have a question and answer. So we'll probably talk for about 20-25 minutes together, and then we'll open it up for kind of a back and forth, and Michelle will help moderate that time. And I just want to name who's in the room today. There's a lot of folks that are Carsey alumni from all the different programs I can see on the name tags. I know there's faculty from education, guests from Salem State University, of course, and other departments on campus. So I think it's a really good mix in the room. So I hope that you'll enjoy what we talk about and it also spark a bigger large group conversation at the end. Sound good? Okay. All right, so Audrey, as we talked about before we sat in these chairs, I wanted to first talk about, kind of the heart of your work is human rights education. And you say that you make the distinction that there's the right to education and then there's human rights education. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think I think everybody in this room, and probably we went out into the community, would know that there was a right to education. That's a kind of really well-known thing. But I think the right to human rights education is probably less well-known. So when we talk about human rights education, it's not just a kind of thing that we've dreamt up ourselves. It is actually a right, and it's a right in international law. And it's a right that we find right back in from 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says something about what education should be about. But in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it actually spells out what that right to human rights education should be. So we have, if you like, an international document which has been signed across the whole world and ratified in most of the world. And that means that it's monitored, it's checked, you know, governments are accountable to see how that right is being implemented. And it's not just governments that are accountable, but communities have the right to report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and give feedback, and they can disagree with the government and they can say what's missing. So there is this really, really important framework that we're working in.
And I think one thing, you know, you mentioned some countries have ratified the Convention for Human Rights and others have not, and I think are the rights of the child. And I think that that's a big distinction for our culture here in the United States, because we are one of the countries that haven't always ratified international or United Nations conventions or documents. And so thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, yes, the US has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but I think the Convention on the Rights of the Child has actually had an impact on this country. I don't think we should pretend that it hasn't. It's been ratified by more or less the whole world, and I believe it's the most highly ratified convention in the world, and I think it's really changed how we think about childhood. It's really changed the culture of childhood and what we understand by childhood. And I'm sure that that's had an impact here as well. The fact that the US hasn't ratified it, I mean, there are various explanations of why that should be, and people talk about US exceptionalism. There's been lots of campaigning and pressure to ratify it. Sometimes people explain it in terms of the difference between federal government and states, but Germany has that kind of federal government, and yet it has ratified it. So yes, we'd like the United States to ratify it, but I still think that it has an influence here, and it can set agendas here, and it can support teachers here, which is my interest. I'm interested in schools and how they can implement these goals. And I don't think simply because the government hasn't taken initiative on something, it doesn't mean that the community, the city, a city, if you like, could sign up to it and say, we support this. So there's no reason why it can't be a powerful tool to people here, and of course here in the School of Public Policy, there's no reason why it can't also be used as a powerful tool.
Well, and I think like that, like the framework in the Convention for the Rights of Children, you know, I think you and I looked at two different articles. One was like the right to be heard, and then again the right to education. And I think you make a point in one of your books from 2016, Human Rights in Schooling, an ethical framework for teaching for social justice. You make a lot of connections between global and local, and I think that that's like a really important conversation for all of us, and one that we have in this school and also in education in general, is like how do we make those connections to what is maybe aspirational versus what is practical. What do we see on a global level that is actually happening for us locally? And so I'm, you know, how like, talk a little bit more about, you know, how you see the Convention on Human Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is useful for educators here in the US, especially at a local level.
Right. Well, I think it's important to know that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a document which is, I think personally, is quite readable. I don't think anybody in this room would have difficult understanding it, or for it. It's a legal document, but it's not complex. But the language is maybe difficult, and certainly would be difficult for the very smallest children. First of all, I think it's worth knowing that it's been made available in child-friendly versions, and that teachers can use it in their classrooms. Teacher educators can use it with their students. So it's not, it's something that's very accessible. It spells out in Article 28 the right to education, and then in Article 29 it specifies, what should this education look like, and it talks about an education which teaches respect for the child's parents, for the child's culture, for the culture of the country in which they're living. So any anxieties that people might have, that this is sort of anti-US or not part of us, it's encouraging a standard of respect for the culture of the country in which children are growing up, and other countries across the globe, including the countries from which some of those children may originate or their families may originate. And it talks about respect for the natural environment. So all these things, many teachers may be doing them already, but it gives legitimacy. So, if a teacher feels uncertain about what are these agreed national standards, they can know they're working within an accepted framework. I think that's really valuable and very, very accessible. You can ask children to draw up what they think is a Charter of Rights, see what they come up with, and they could debate that, discuss it, and if they claim, I have the right to ice cream, or I have the right to go to bed when I please, or whatever, they can then discuss these amongst themselves. How does that impact on my life, and how does that impact on my parents' lives, or whatever. And they can begin to realize that they don't have absolute rights, that most rights are qualified. We don't have the right to do as we please. We have rights which are related to the rights of others. So it is very much, sometimes people claim that a rights framework is a very individualistic thing. I actually think it's about learning to live together in community. Yeah. In fact, I did a course at Beijing Normal University. You might think that's a very strange place to be working on human rights education, but I think you can work on human rights education more or less anywhere. Yeah, we just simply chose a careful title for our course, and we called it Learning to Live Together. And I think that's basically what human rights framework is all about.
Yeah, I think, well, just reflecting on the community part and building community, from my experience as an early childhood educator, I spent a lot of time in circles with young children where we talked about, what is our community going to be? There's 20 of us in this room, there's 50 of us when we combine with the older kids, what do we want our rules to be? How are we going to help each other across the ages? Even things like we help each other tie shoes if you know how to tie a shoe and someone else doesn't know how to tie a shoe yet. And I think I love the focus on, our work in New Hampshire Listens is really focused on local democracy, local discussion, local conversation, people talking about what matters most to them in their communities. And I do agree. I think children can do the same thing at the understand community that they're either building in their schools or they're part of in their just larger community. And so how many times do we pause to welcome in younger voices, even the youngest of voices, into those spaces? So I like that that's a beautiful, I think that's a beautiful thing to do in a beautiful way, especially, so I'm going to go and talk a little bit about our schools right now here in New Hampshire, and how there's quite a bit of legislation happening that is making conversations really challenging, and I think, and questioning a lot of human rights of people. And we had a lunch earlier, and we were talking at lunch with a group about how some of the language written in legislation and policy right now is convoluted. It's hard to understand. It has many different meanings. And so for everyday people, it can be really scary to figure out what I can do, what I can't do. And at times, human rights are suffering. I think a lot of human rights are suffering right now just from the silence of confusion and linking in schools, the work I do in schools, that discussion around even simple words of justice, social justice, diversity, inclusion, belonging. And so, I'm thinking and wondering, for you, as you're listening to our experiences in New Hampshire, what else are you seeing and what reflections do you have?
Well, I have to be honest, I only arrived in New Hampshire
I know.
about 24 hours, maybe 26 hours ago.
I know.
And this is my first visit to this part of the US. I've been to the US many times, but this is my first visit to this very beautiful part of the US. So I've been very excited about it. A little bit confused, yes, when all the place names sound like the ones from home, but, but nevertheless, yeah, I've not had a chance to tune into those things carefully, but I do recognize that across the world that there are threats to human rights, and there are movements that would prefer more authoritarian governments, movements that would prefer that democracy didn't really work or would work just for them. So I think we have to be very mindful of those kinds of activities all the time. And I think that it's really, really important that we have the chance with students in classrooms to find a way of talking about these things which are not seen to be partisan or going against their families, but just opening up a space and finding out what they're listening to, what they're hearing on the news, what they're hearing from social media, and actually sharing with them different perspectives, the fact that teaching them a degree of media literacy, because children have digital worlds that we probably as adults aren't even fully aware of. Depends how much parents show it, keep a close eye on what their children's digital worlds look like. But I suspect that none of us, that for them, childhood is very, very different than it is for even people who were children 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's really, really important that we get to grips with that. And I think media literacy has to be a part of that, has to be a part of education. And it's probably also a very important part of human rights education, understanding that human rights aren't just claiming things for me or celebrities claiming things or whatever, but human rights are inclusive of everybody. This language, diversity. We asked children, one of my students went into school in Norway and asked children the meaning of diversity. They hadn't a clue. They could talk about race, they could talk about ethnicity, but they were much more direct about it. And diversity was the polite Norwegian equivalent, was the polite word that adults were using, what they thought was the polite word, and children really hadn't got a clue. So I think we need to have a conversation about what words actually mean. Justice, well, I think we can divide it up. We can talk about economic justice. What is economic justice? Is it you earning as much as you want for the job you do, or is it making sure that nobody in your community goes hungry? I think these are really important concepts, and that children will have their own views on those, because even the youngest children know what they think is fair and not fair. And I think a sense of justice is probably that nobody does go hungry, that nobody should be homeless. But children will have their own views and understandings of this. And this is politics, yes, but this is politics in a very accessible way for children. I think it's important that they have the chance to do that. They're not going to suddenly come to the age of 18 and know how to vote and know what to do if they haven't had a chance to debate these things amongst themselves.
I agree with that. We're going to get to questions in just a little bit. I am mindful of the time. I'm going to read a quote from your 2016 book, and I'm just going to invite you to respond to it. Okay. Okay, so I was drawn to the statement that people need to develop skills to struggle for and to realize their own just communities. And the processes of human rights education must necessarily empower learners to be more effective in the ongoing struggle for rights. It must enable them to critique existing power structures and equip them with the skills for transformation and change. Only then will education for human rights be effective. And I think you started to talk about that, but as I'm reading your own words to you, what comes up for you?
The word struggle. I think rights are not guaranteed. Just because the previous generation enjoyed a set of rights doesn't mean that they're ours and they're secure. I think we need to be willing to defend rights and defend the rights of the most vulnerable. So I think that is a very, very crucial part of learning about why do human rights exist? I think they exist to protect the vulnerable. And at this moment, you may feel vulnerable, you may very well feel insecure, but I think everybody feels vulnerable at some point in their life. Everybody is vulnerable at some point in their life, either when they're very young, possibly when they're very old, when they're ill, when they have to face challenges. So human rights are there to protect us. So that's, I think vulnerability stands out for me in what I'm arguing for. A human rights education where we see ourselves as a community, where we're willing not just to tie each other's shoes up when we're tiny children, but to help each other out, to support, to work in our communities. And it's global. If children learn at a young age that everybody everywhere has these rights, then what are our obligations to people in distant places? I think we do have obligations to people in distant places. I think, for example, the fact that Europe is so super rich now and compared to some parts in the world isn't just happened by chance. It happened because there's a colonial history and we need to face that. So there are those kinds of conversations that we need to have. And so human rights education isn't just confined to civics or geography, but it also relates to understanding history and who we are.
I think, and I just have couple more questions about, so I explained to you a little bit about, at the Carsey School, and we talked about, about civics and civic education is something that's really something that people in the United States talk a lot about. And you talk a little bit about that in your book as well. And so I wanted to ask you, in relation to kind of this call for like global to local human rights education, action to help people at a very young age understand that they have rights. They have these human rights that are global, and then the nested rights they also have within their country or community. So I'm going to quote you again. You said, a framework is needed whereby service learning extends beyond activities that encourage charity and goodwill to the less fortunate, to activities in which students are encouraged to show solidarity with their fellow humankind. And so I think like when we think of ourselves as a service community, as a land-grant institution in New Hampshire, publicly funded, we have an obligation of service, in my mind, as a member of the faculty and as a former, and as an alumni. And so I was drawn to that as like, what do you see as beyond what is that difference between the charity goodwill versus like the other types of work to be done?
I think in the kind of civic education that students might have, or in the experience that they have at university, but they shouldn't just be like, I don't know, setting up a food bank or serving people, I don't know, in homeless or whatever, but that they should also have an opportunity to understand why homelessness exists. Is it a political issue, or is it what is it? Mm-hmm. I do believe when we look at the world we live in that there are enough resources there to ensure that every child, for example, has an education. And if there are barriers to education, then I think we have a duty, if you like, to explore why everybody in our community is not getting an education, where they're not. What is excluding them? And I think everybody has the right to good health. So this is also about politics. It's also about exploring what the models are that we operate to. Do they work? Do they not work? How could they be improved? What can we learn from other contexts? And you know, we just lived through a global pandemic. What are we learning from that? Were the vaccination programs that we had access to, but people in other countries didn't have access to, was that acceptable? And this is a political question, but children should have an opportunity to discuss that. You know, who's benefiting from a government choosing a particular vaccine, for example. These are all things that young people will be curious about, interested in. And I think these basic questions about education, about health, are things that are going to engage everybody, because everybody knows, everybody in the higher education community has experienced education, hopefully successfully. Even in a primary school, in the elementary school, they're learning about each other and so on. So they will all know about health. So let's have these discussions with the youngest children and with our students at the university, and look beyond serving the community because others are less fortunate than me, and actually working towards a community that everybody benefits. And I don't believe that one group benefit at the expense of the other. I think we can learn how to discuss resources that we might all benefit from.
And then you have two books coming out soon. What I really love about your work, Audrey, as I've looked through, I've listened to some videos of you, I've spent the day with you, you know, read your 2016 book. I really love how you're able to really talk at all the levels of humanity. You know, you really talk at the global, you can talk at this country, and then also like you know, as Dan mentioned, have this life histories research approach. So you have a couple books coming out, a research anthology, Nordic Perspectives on Human Rights Education, that you're editing, and then a very special book for you that's coming out about called Where Are You From? No, Where Are You Really From? And so I just wanted you to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about this, because I know you're very excited about both.
Yeah, well, the first book is Nordic Perspectives on Human Rights. The Nordic countries have a wonderful, Nordic Perspectives on Human Rights Education. So we're asking scholars to contribute from Finland, from Denmark, from Sweden, from Iceland. Have I missed a country? Probably. Help me out. Sorry? Sweden, yes, Sweden, definitely. There should be. Anyway, all the Nordic countries have a reputation of being human rights friendly countries. It's part of their identity. But how far we're interested in knowing, have they really implemented human rights education? So that's what we're getting, including indigenous scholars, including the different perspectives from those countries. It's an academic book. The second one, Where Are You From? No, Where Are You Really From? Is a question that anybody, people of color, people who are migrants will have heard. Anybody who has a foreign accent will have heard those questions. So I've traced my own family back to 18th century India. And it was quite an exciting journey looking at family stories. I love stories. I'm interested in how stories have remained in my family over generations, how they've not been lost. And I think we all have family stories that we can share. And I think if we're very sincere about, as educators, in building an education which is child-centered or student-centered, then we have to listen to students, we have to listen to their stories. So I'm telling my family story, which I think brings out some bigger issues. It brings out the notion of family throughout the British Empire. We all know about these great generals who went round fighting in battles and winning and stealing loot and carrying them back to museums in Europe. We all know about those things. But what was going on for women in those situations? What was going on for families in that situation? And what about families like mine who were somehow colonized, but sometimes also acted as colonizers? So life is never simple. It's full of contradictions. And I think that telling stories like that, you always uncover secrets about your family you didn't find out.
Yeah,
But,
I know
but you really get to the heart of what our history is. If we don't have our history isn't just written by other people, it's written by you and me telling our individual stories and together building up a communal story. And that can happen in the university and it can happen in the primary school classroom.
And I think that is such a big link to public policy and education and just the conversations that we have to have that are humanizing. And I agree. I think family stories and across time and really unpacking the complexity and sharing together is such an important thing to do. So it's wonderful. We're going to turn to some questions.
All right. I was kind of hoping we'd get back to the ice cream as a fundamental human right.
I know.
So I'm going to come around and see who has a question and wants to ask something. And while people are thinking, if they want to put their hands up, I'm wondering if you could name some of the rights that are listed in the convention for the rights of the child.
Me? Yeah.
Yeah, just
Yeah. The
3
right
or
to
4.
health.
I know there's a bunch, but
The right to learn about your culture, the right to learn about the natural environment, the right to life. Yeah, there's a few.
You had talked a little bit about diversity, and I just wanted to understand the point you were trying to make. Were you saying that the children didn't understand the concept because it didn't really matter to them, that children are naturally more accepting, or were you saying that we needed to explain diversity at that age?
I think the children concerned in Norway just didn't know the word. They didn't use the word. It wasn't part of their everyday language. But they did understand that people were diverse. They did understand that people were different. It's just that adults were using a word which wasn't part of their everyday vocabulary. So I think that's interesting on 2 levels, where we talking about diversity as a hiding more complex questions. Was it a euphemism for talking about injustice or justice? Was it a euphemism for recognizing that society is multicultural? These things were not, children were familiar with the concept multiculturalism. They knew that, well, not multicultural, they understood the concept multicultural, that children in the classroom had different religions, different cultures, but diversity they felt was just a word that was not part of their language.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. Welcome to New Hampshire. So while I personally regret the fact that the U.S. hasn't ratified this, I'm kind of curious, like sometimes my own experience, and this may not hold true in all things, is that when communities, states will adopt these kinds of frameworks on their own. In other words, in spite of government oversight and reporting and all of those things, that can oftentimes be more compelling and frankly something more so to cherish. What I'm curious is, in your research, worldwide, are there other examples of these kinds of things in schools happening that are measurable, that are being done either it's a nation that hasn't ratified it, or even if it's a government that is signed on, it's really coming from the bottom up. It's not because the government is saying you have to do. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I think that there is no country in the world that I've come across that has a really advanced human rights education curriculum. But governments have ratified the Convention on the Rights of a Child, but they don't necessarily implement a detailed human rights curriculum. And I think that's a challenge, and I think you're right about communities and things coming up from the bottom up, because governments are responsible for upholding our human rights. And I think we have to ask the question, how much do they want us to know about those human rights? And in many parts of the world, and perhaps it's inconvenient if we're making demands on government. So yes, I think it's really, really important that things come from the bottom up. So I don't know if I've forgotten part of your question.
No, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I guess the last part of the question that I probably didn't pose the question in a very succinct way is have you observed in any of those nations where it is robust in some way or another, at least in your opinion, is there anything we can learn from that so that our educational system, academia, and all that can take best practices? Like what would be the method of transformational change that we could do, perhaps here in the US and elsewhere, to help institute this from the bottom up? Because, for example, in the US, it's not going to come from the top down. I mean, we either have disinterested politicians, or in some cases, maybe they're hostile towards it. We know that that's okay. We can dismiss that. But I would hate to think that as a nation, we would let what we can't do get in the way of what we can.
Okay.
What have you seen that we could actually use?
There are some very, very useful handbooks. There's one called Compass, which is published by the Council of Europe, and one of the main authors is a US human rights educator, Nancy Flowers. So there are books out there with lots of practical ideas, and there's one that follows it through. I think it's called Compasito, which is aimed at the youngest children and ideas. So there are plenty of materials out there. UNICEF produces materials. So there are many, many groups of materials that you can use, and very practical ideas. Sometimes countries implement human rights education at local level, and it doesn't always work as well as it should. I remember going to a school in South Korea where the rights of a child had been written on every step, and the children were taught that they had to obey these things. And I don't think that rights are about learning to obey. I think they're about learning to discuss and think through and recognize shared values rather than teach children that they are something to obey. So countries vary. I don't pick South Korea out as a bad example. I think across the world there are teachers doing fabulous things, and sometimes their teachers are under pressure and they teach to conform because they think it might make their lives easier. I think human rights education can make teachers' lives easier, because it actually, although rights and responsibilities are not directly linked, so I don't have rights if I don't take any responsibility, that doesn't mean I don't have any rights. I still have those rights regardless of whether I act responsibly, but actually my rights depend on you acting responsibly, and mine depend, and vice versa. So there are many practical materials.
Thank you.
I have a quick question over here. So we're at a School of Public Policy, and we often think about a School of Public Policy as working through channels of government. I think all of us who work for this school recognize that we actually do this through a number of different avenues. I think our academic programs, get to that point. I think our research gets to that point. I think the community-based work we do gets to that point. So I'm just curious if both of you, Carrie and Audrey, if you could speak about, is there a role for public policy in this space? And is there a role for, community organizations or individuals in this space? And how do we think about that? How do we think about those two relating together? So I'll leave it at that.
Sure. I guess I think about the connections between I always make this movement like public policy. And then like people on the ground, people in their lives, you know, like we are right here. And I think that I'm thinking about a bunch of different groups. You know, I work with groups all over New Hampshire, all different positions, and they're all working for some sort of like public good or like a change in a system. And I'm thinking about one group in particular, this work group that was focused on race and equity in government. And they were looking to build a tool, an equity impact note, and to really, I think, ground some like racial awareness, some I would say human rights awareness in legislation, like asking legislators, have you attended to these things? And so I think like there is some frames and grounding that exist. I mean, even like the Declaration itself or the rights of children. Yeah, I think that you can ground those decisions and that those conversations that then walk up to what the policy may be written as or realized as, and you can like, by knowing more about global human rights and then how that's nested in our communities locally or statewide or in the United States, speaking of here, yeah, I think you can, if you use human rights and you learn about them and you can center the public policy decisions around them, I think you'll have more inclusive public policies that could be realized. Or
Yeah.
maybe that's my hope.
Yes. I also think, related to your question, is that there are rights and then there are duty bearers. And public servants, people in positions, whether it's at city level or whatever, they have duties towards communities. Rights cannot happen without them acting as duty bearers. Teachers are duty bearers in this. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important that the School of Public Policy or any policy institute is communicating that notion around duty bearers. And yes, this isn't just about schools, it's not just about government, it's about communities, it's about trade unions. All these kinds of groups are people's groups. It's not just communities either, but trade unions might operate at a national level. There are loads and loads of people who need basic understanding, awareness raising, and who are also doing awareness raising. And I think it would be, teachers have professional standards, for example. Other professional groups have professional standards. Social workers have professional standards. I understand that in the US, that social workers have a framework which is human rights orientated. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there are very many ways into this. And yeah, I think School of Public Policy is a great way, great place to communicate with those professional groups. Sometimes, I don't know how the word trade union goes down in this country, but another way of using that language would be professional organizations. Mm-hmm. All these people can be engaged in this work, and these are all groups with whom I believe we should engage and do, I think, engage in many respects. Mm-hmm.
Hi, oh wow, okay. Hi, so my name is Antonio Serna. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student here at the Carsey School. I'm kind of curious because a lot of what you've talked about is kind of communicating and educating about kind of basic human rights principles to people and, you know, kind of, and how they, you know, facilitate that learning amongst themselves, right? But I'm also kind of curious whether there's a space on the other side to kind of showcase what infringements of human rights looks like and what and how you would go about educating that, and whether that, you know, that's involved in this communication work.
a very big question and quite difficult to answer quickly. I wouldn't want you to go away and think that it should only be about principles. I think it's about people's everyday experiences, and that we do have a sense of justice, we do have a sense of human rights in communities. It doesn't have to come down to us. So I would like to, if you like, re-emphasize the point that Dan was making, that this can come, and indeed you were making, Carrie, that this can be grounded upwards. When we come to abuses, I think, yes, but as long as we're not teaching about abuse in different parts of the world, you know, oh, we're enjoying our human rights here in Norway, or we're enjoying our human rights in the US, and isn't it sad that people in country X or Y lack the wonderful life we lead. I think human rights is in the end about holding governments accountable for those things they've signed up to. So if there are abuses, then yes, I think we can explore those and draw the attention of people to those. And I think that's also a responsibility of journalists. And we have to ask ourselves, how well are our journalists educated in human rights? That should be a fundamental part of their training. So yes, abuses, and also if you're talking about young children, they should know what their rights are, and there may be abuses of their rights that they feel very strongly about and can discuss and know that you know, shouldn't be infringed. So yes, abuses do play a part, I think.
Hello. My name is Sonic. I'm a faculty member in the Global Conflict and Human Security Master's Program. And I was hoping that you could talk about the power of the principles and applications of human rights education when the student body themselves are vulnerable or having interruptions in their education, such as internally displaced or refugee students, juveniles who are incarcerated, where the less than ideal educational environment is tied itself to a human rights issue.
Right. I think you've raised a really key question. I've worked a lot in post-conflict situations, post-conflict countries, and usually I think that's a euphemism. All post-conflict societies are conflict-ridden. So yes, and often those are the places where human rights education has been most powerful. It's not necessarily going to look the same. If you're teaching about and learning the principles and learning the questions and responding to creating a human rights culture amongst the most privileged, you're going to be doing it in a different way than if you're working with people, particularly young people who are vulnerable. So I think the important thing to remember is when you're teaching human rights principles and standards with young people who aren't accessing those right now, is to ensure that we're not creating disillusionment, just disengagement, but actually framing that education so they can see it's part of a struggle which isn't just about them and their personal struggle, but which is about a wider struggle to resolve their problems. So I think it's really important, for example, when we're dealing with undocumented migrants, to know for children from those communities, for example, to know that there are people willing to work with them in solidarity, and that these aren't questions that are left to them to solve, but it's part of the wider community. So yes, let's guard against cynicism and disillusionment when the realities are very, very different from the ideals, but those young people have a right to know what their rights are, and to have support in realizing those rights. And so it's about skills, it's about enablement, it's about the thing that you were talking about, I think, with young people Carrie, about ensuring that civic education programs at all levels aren't just teaching a set of ideals that are only available to a small group, but actually part of a program which is action orientated. So making sure that that education is action orientated and supporting those young people in taking action. Those are the principles. It's a long question there.
I think we'll take one more question. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Melinda, also a faculty member in the Global Conflict and Human Security Program. So I do research on human rights in Turkey, and it's a very challenging environment, and teachers are very constrained, and so human rights organizations have done some summer camps to teach human rights education and that sort of thing. But you mentioned the Nordic countries, so my mind always goes to Turkey, and then the Nordic countries, the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and how the Nordic countries have done a really good job. So what are some of the lessons from the Nordic countries in terms of human rights education for the US, for a country like Turkey? What are they doing right?
Very, very interesting question. I work in Norway, which is, I think, the first country, they revised their constitution in 2014, where human rights education is now a constitutional right, as I read it. So that might inspire those of you who are lawyers. However, I'm not convinced that that makes it that much stronger. You have to then have other systems. What are they doing right?
Too many or not? Nothing.
I think they're doing right in the sense that they're encouraging young people to have human rights identities. They're encouraging people to think about a culture of human rights. They're encouraging them to think that to be Norwegian or to be Swedish is to defend human rights. So I think that's powerful. What they're not necessarily doing is facing up to some human rights challenges within the country, to facing up to the inequalities between the mainstream population and indigenous populations today, or actually facing up to some of the injustices for migrant populations today. If you have this wonderful human rights identity, I think it can be very, very powerful, but it can also be a risk that you can be complacent, that you don't need to teach, for example, about racism because, well, it doesn't exist here, it exists in countries that have this colonial history, and to not recognize your own part in that colonial history. So I think there are some good things and some problematic things there. So I don't think we should hold up any country as too much of a perfect country, although some countries have been very, very effective in if you like, international propaganda that gives human rights give a country power. If you can seem to be human rights defenders, that increases that country's power in the world. So I just don't think we should always assume that everything is perfect in those countries. And I think the challenge in those countries is to encourage young people to defend the human rights of the people in their own country as much as they're willing to stand up for injustice in distant places.
I think we need to give both Dr. Osler and Dr. Portrie a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for just such a wonderful conversation, and I learned so much just sitting here listening to the two of you, so I really appreciate it.